Hi, and welcome to part 2 of my series on 35mm film photography for beginners. In this video, I'm going to explain all about exposure. The purpose of exposure is to capture your subject so that it looks just right, not too light or not too dark, with detail in the highlights and detail in the shadow areas. Now, there are 4 things that make up exposure: the quantity or brightness of the light, the ISO or speed of the film, also the aperture that you set on the lens, and the shutter speed you set on the camera. So first, let's talk about the brightness of the light. The brightest light you will have to deal with is usually midday on a sunny day with no clouds. The dimmest light could be a single candle indoors, and there are a bunch of different light levels in between. So we need a way to actually measure that brightness. And the tool we use to do that is either a handheld light meter, as you see here, or the light meter built into our cameras. Now, most cameras introduced since 1964 have built-in internal meters that measure the light through the lens. And like the handheld meter, they are reflected light meters. They measure the light reflected from the subject. Now, these handheld meters, 2 of which you see here, also measure incident light. And incident light is light falling on the subject. And we'll get into the differences in a minute. But let's just talk about reflected light meter first. So the first thing you need to do, whether you're using the handheld or the built-in meter, is set the ISO of the film we're using on the meter. ISO is also sometimes referred to as ISO, and it's the speed of the film, which is its sensitivity to light. One quick note, we used to refer to film speed as ASA. You will see that on older cameras and meters, as you can see on this meter. This meter dates from the late 60s, early 70s. However, ISO and ASA are exactly the same. I don't remember when they went from ASA to ISO. I believe it was sometime maybe in the 80s. ASA was American standard. ISO is international standard. All right, so 400 ISO is the same as 400 ASA. The lower the ISO of the film, the less sensitive it is to light. This particular roll you see here is a good general purpose film. It's a speed of 400, and it's always marked on the box. It's also marked on the cartridge inside the box. And 400 speed film is more sensitive to light than a film with the speed of 125, which is called a slower film. Now, there is more to film than just its ISO. There's more that we need to know about it, but for our purposes now, talking about exposure, that's all we're going to worry about is the speed of the film. So you set that speed. If you have 400 speed film in your camera and you have a handheld meter, let's just focus this up here. Okay, and you can see here, ASA 400. If I had the 125 speed film in the camera, I would set this to 125. If I had 800 speed film, I would set it to 800. If you are using a camera with a built-in meter, you would set that ISO on the meter on the camera. So 400 is a good general purpose film. A good general purpose black and white film. Kodak makes some excellent black and white 400 speed films, Tri-X-Pan or T-Max 400. All do a great job. So we set the film speed on our light meter or on our camera. Let's now look at how aperture and shutter speed work together before we learn how to use a light meter. Let me explain how aperture and shutter speed work in combination to give us proper exposure. The aperture is the lens opening, working like the iris in our eye. A large opening lets in a lot of light. A small opening, a smaller amount of light. The aperture setting is indicated by numbers, such as 1.4, which is a large opening, or 16, which is a small opening. The range of apertures in a lens depends on the lens. Some lenses start with an opening of 1.2, which is a very wide opening, and go all the way down to 16, the smallest opening on that particular lens. Other lenses may start at 2.8 and go to 22. As we go from the smaller numbers, and the smaller numbers indicate a larger opening. For example, 2.0. If we go from 2.0, which is a large opening, to higher numbers such as 4.0, we are letting in half as much light. So a typical range on a camera may be 1.4, then we go to 2.0, then to 2.8, then to 4 or 4.0, then 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22. That's a typical range of some lenses. As we go to the higher numbers, from 2.0 to 4, we are letting in half as much light as we go up the scale. 5.6 lets in half as much light as 4.0. 8.0 lets in half as much light as 5.6, and so forth. Going the opposite way, for example, from 16 to 11, we are letting in twice as much light. We refer to those aperture numbers as f-stops. Okay, so if someone asks us what aperture we shot a particular photo at, we may say it was shot at f5.6. Or someone may say, well, that picture's a little dark. Open up a stop. What that means is go from, let's say, 8 to the next largest opening, which would be 5.6. So opening up one stop could mean going from f8 to f5.6 or from f2.8 to f2. Now, there is more to aperture than just the amount of light it lets in, but that will be the topic for the next video. So let's just look at some apertures here. Here we have a 35mm 2.8 lens. And when we refer to a lens as a 35mm 2.8 or a 50mm 1.4, the aperture is the maximum aperture for that lens. So a 50mm 2.8 has a maximum aperture of 2.8. A 50mm 1.4 has a maximum aperture of 1.4. So this is a 35mm 2.8. It has an aperture range from 2.8, the widest opening, to 16, the smallest opening. Right now it is set at its widest opening of 2.8. I removed the front element group of this lens so you could clearly see the aperture. Okay, and now I'm going to change that aperture, go one stop smaller to 4. Okay, you can see it's smaller. Now we're going to change it to 5.6. Okay, and you could see it getting smaller. Now I'm going to go to 8, f8. All right, and you could see f8 is even smaller, letting in less light to the film. Now we're going to go to 11. Okay, and of course it's even smaller, again, letting in less light. And finally, we're going to go to the smallest aperture on this lens, f16. You can see that's a very small opening. Now, let me just make another thing clear. f8 on this 35mm 2.8 lens lets in the same amount of light as f8 on a 135mm lens. Lets in the same amount of light as a 50mm lens. f8 is f8, f5.6 is f5.6 on any lens. Now there are slight variations in lenses, how much light they transmit. For our purposes, however, just think of f8 on any lens, on any camera, as letting in the same amount of light as f8 or any aperture on any camera, okay? 5.6, 8, 11, 2.8, whatever the aperture indicated on that lens, whatever it's set for, lets in just as much light as the same setting on any other lens. The other thing that controls the amount of light to expose the film is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the length of time that the shutter curtains are open to allow light to expose the film. Now, most 35mm interchangeable lens cameras have what's called a focal plane shutter. The shutter curtains sit just in front of the film. Now here we have a Nikon F camera, which I removed the back, and right in the center here you can see the shutter curtains. They're made of titanium. Okay, so I am now going to press the shutter release. I have it set for a 1 second exposure, which is a long exposure, lets in a lot of light. All right, and you can see that shutter was open for 1 second. The film normally will be going across right behind the curtains. Now let's just look at the shutter speeds on this particular camera. And it's typical of many 35mm cameras from the 60s into the 70s. They had speeds from 1 full second all the way up to 1/1000th of a second. And again, 1/1000th of a second is going to let in very little light. Now there's more to shutter speed than just how much light it lets in or how long it's open, and we'll get into that in the next video. But so we saw what a second looks like. Why don't we set it for a more typical speed you may use when hand holding the camera, 1/125th of a second. Okay, shutter is cocked. Let's just center it up so you can see. You see that was pretty fast. All right, and now we're going to go to the fastest speed, 1/1000th of a second. And that was extremely fast. You know, modern cameras have even faster speeds. Modern digital cameras and go up to speeds of up to 1/8000th of a second or higher. And also they have timed slower speeds down to 30 seconds or longer. We can get a longer shutter speed on a camera like this if we set it to the B setting. When we set it to the B setting and we press the shutter release, the shutter opens and remains open until we take our finger off the shutter release. That would only be used for obviously long exposures with the camera set on a tripod. You can never handhold the camera at those very slow speeds, you know, a half a second or a second or even a quarter of a second. Now one more thing on the range of shutter speeds on the camera. So 1 second lets in the most light of the time speeds. Okay, we go to a half a second, it's going to let in half as much light. A quarter of a second, half as much again from the previous speed, and so forth. Okay, kind of works just like aperture. As we go to the faster shutter speeds, we're letting in half as much light as the previous speed. As we open up, as we go to slower speeds, we're letting in twice as much light to the film. Again, the same way the aperture works. So the shutter speed, in conjunction with the aperture, depending on our film speed and the quantity of light, how bright the light is, sunny day, indoors by candlelight, or just room lights, all those things combine to give us proper exposure. So the shutter speed and aperture depend on the quantity of light and the speed of our film. Okay, to understand the relationship between aperture and shutter speed and how they combine to give you proper exposure, I set up a little example here using a champagne glass, a faucet, and the water coming out of the faucet will represent the light. When the champagne glass is full, that will represent proper exposure. Okay? The width of the stream of water will represent the aperture, and the length of time that the spigot is open, that the water is running, will be the shutter speed. So I'm going to now just have a small stream of water come out of the spigot. All right, let's get the glass lined up. Okay, and you could see how narrow that stream of water is. That represents a small aperture, let's say f11 or f16, and it's going to take a longer shutter speed to fill that glass than if we had a wide stream of water. Okay, so you can see how long that took. It's now full. We now have proper exposure. Now we're going to dump that. And now we're going to put the water on at full blast, and we're going to have a wide stream. And you see how wide that stream is and how quickly it filled the glass. It filled the glass very quickly, representing a faster shutter speed. So I hope that explains a little bit better maybe the relationship between shutter speed and aperture. When you have a wide aperture, a wide opening on the lens, let's say 2.0 or 1.4, that lets in a lot of light. We need a faster shutter speed in order to get proper exposure. If we have a very small aperture on the lens, 11 or 16, that's going to require a longer exposure, a longer shutter speed, maybe a half a second or a quarter of a second. Again, it all depends on the quantity of light. Okay, now that we know how aperture and shutter speed combine to give us proper exposure, let us look at how we can use a handheld meter or a built-in camera meter to determine how to set our shutter speed and aperture for that proper exposure. Let me explain how to use the handheld meter. We aim it at our subject and press this button here on the right. This needle will then deflect if we had batteries in it. Let's say it goes to 14. We then set our meter on this scale here to 14. Okay, right here you see the 14. And what that does, it gives us a combination of shutter speeds and apertures to give us proper exposure for this particular scene. Now you could see here we have 1/125th of a second at f4, or 1/250th of a second at 2.8, or coming to the other side here, f8 at 1/30th of a second. All right, you can see what it says here. Time is on the top, on the outer scale. The inner scale has f, and that is our f-stops, okay, from from 1.0 all the way up to f90, all right? And you won't see those numbers, anything above 32 on a 35mm camera. Those were for older view cameras or large format cameras, so you won't have to worry about that. But anyway, so you could see that there are various combinations that will give you proper exposure. All right, and again, in the next video, we're going to get into why you may choose a 15th of a second at f11 over, let's say, a 2/50th of a second at 2.8. But for our purposes right now, we just need to know that any one of these combinations should give you proper exposure. And it works the same way with the built-in meter, except with the built-in meter on the camera, you are centering a needle in the viewfinder using a combination of shutter speed and aperture. Now, some cameras, some more modern cameras actually starting around 1970, had various forms of automation, such as shutter priority, where you selected the shutter speed and the camera selected the aperture, or aperture priority, where you selected the aperture and the camera selected the shutter speed, so you don't have to worry about centering a needle. And then they went to program mode, where you just set the camera for program mode and the camera automatically picked your shutter speed and aperture. For our purposes, learning, I think it's much better to use a manual camera, a camera where you set the exposure, both the shutter speed and the aperture yourself. Okay, now I just want to show you real quick a more modern meter, and easier to use than the older meter. So I set my ISO, okay, to, here, we'll leave it set to 400. All right, and then I press this button here on the right, and it gives me a reading. It's 1/125th of a second at 4.5. Now, I could change that shutter speed. I change it to a 60th of a second, and the proper exposure would be 6.3. Or I could go the other way, go up to 2/50th of a second, and it's asking for an aperture of 3.2. One more thing with these meters, with the reflected light meter. If you were taking pictures, let's say, of your kids at the beach. They're playing by the water. You're a little bit back up on the beach, and you aim your reflected light meter at the kids from, let's say, 10 feet away. Well, these meters read an angle of view approximately 40 degrees. It's not only going to see the kids, it's also going to pick up a lot of that bright light behind them, that bright sky or the water. And what happens then, that meter's not going to know that you're taking a picture of your kids, and because it's seeing so much bright light, it's going to want you to close down your lens, to use a smaller lens opening or a faster shutter speed, and your children are going to be underexposed. And what happens in the final print, they're going to be too dark, almost a silhouette. I'm sure you've seen that situation. So you need to compensate a little bit for that. One way is to move in close to the children to make sure the meter is just seeing them, so you're not picking up all that sky. The other thing is to make an adjustment to your exposure. Maybe open up a stop. When I say open up a stop, that means if the meter indicates f11, you might want to shoot at f8 or even a little wider. Or you could do it with shutter speed. If the camera is indicating a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, well, you may want to set it for 1/250th of a second. And you'll learn how much compensation you may need, how much exposure compensation you may need as you gain more experience. Now, the same holds true if the background is very dark. So let's say you're photographing one of your kids and there's a very dark background, some very dark brick, let's say. And now, same thing, and the meter's going to see all that dark brick and indicate an exposure that may overexpose your kids, okay? Because it's seeing that darkness. And then your kids are going to be washed out, all right, in the final picture. But one thing to keep in mind, if you're not sure, a couple things you could do. One is bracket your exposure. What that means is take a picture with what the meter indicates, and then open up a stop and take another picture, and then close down a stop and take another picture. That way you're sure to get one that is acceptable. Now you may need to do more than one stop in each direction depending on the situation. And obviously that's not easy to do with a moving subject. So, you know, if you're taking pictures of a building or a landscape or something, that's easy to do. If you're taking pictures of your kids playing by the water, obviously that's a little difficult to do, to bracket your exposures. especially if their expression was great on that first one. It's probably not going to be the same expression on that second or third one. What if you don't have a meter? Okay, so you don't have an exposure meter. You don't have a camera with a built-in meter. What can you do? Well, there are various charts and there's certain rules that you could follow. One thing is called the Sunny 16 rule. What Sunny 16 means, if you were photographing in full sun, no clouds in front of the sun, and your subject, again, is in full sun, you set your aperture to f16, and you set your shutter speed to the speed of the film, or the closest speed to the speed of the film. For example, if you're using 400 speed film on a bright sunny day, you will set your aperture to 16 and your shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, because that's the closest to the 400 of the film. If you're shooting with the 125 speed film that I showed you earlier, that Ilford FP4, you would set your shutter speed to 1/125th of a second and your aperture to f16. So what if you don't want to shoot at f16? You could open up your lens one stop to 11 with that 125 speed film, and then set your shutter speed to 1/250th of a second. And from what we learned earlier, you know that that will yield the proper exposure. Also, there are apps for your phone that give you a meter using your phone. There are also charts describing different light conditions and how you should set your camera for proper exposure. But the best way to do it is, of course, to have either a handheld or a built-in meter. One other thing concerning meters I mentioned earlier when describing these meters is that they measure, these handheld meters, measure reflected light, and that's what we've been talking about so far. They also measure incident light. Incident light is the light falling on the subject. So with an incident meter, you set it for incident reading, this milky hemisphere. You slide over, this reads reflected light. When I push this over here, it's now reading incident light. And then instead of aiming the meter at the subject, if possible, I stand at subject position and aim the meter at the source of the light. Generally, you're aiming it back towards the camera. Pressing the button, it gives you a reading. And that is a very accurate reading because it is not influenced by a bright background or a dark background or the tones of the subject. It is just measuring the light, and it usually gives you a very accurate reading. So what if you're taking a picture of a cityscape across a river? Okay, so obviously you're not going to walk across the river and hold your meter back towards the camera, aiming it back towards the camera. But as long as the light is the same, as long as the buildings in the landscape are not in sun and you are in shade, if they're receiving the same light, then you can stand on the other side of the river and just hold your meter up and aim it towards the light. All right, I'm going to show you now how to use an incident light meter and also a reflected light meter. My wife is playing the piano and we have some windows behind her, so from camera position, I'm going to aim the handheld meter. I have it set for an ISO 400, and the reading I got is 1/60th of a second at 5.0. But because of all that light coming through the window, I know the piano, my wife, and the interior furniture is going to be underexposed. So I'm going to move in closer and take a reading off her back. That gives me a 1/60th of a second at 2.8. Okay, so we're going to set our camera for a 1/60th at 2.8. Now the other option is to take an incident meter reading. So I'm going to put the hemisphere in the proper position, and from subject position, now I'm going to aim the meter back at the camera and take a reading. Another thing you can do when photographing with a reflected light meter, either a handheld one or the one built into your camera, is take a reading off of a gray card. You look online, B&H or Adorama or any of the large suppliers, and just look for 18% gray card or just gray card. And what you do is you take your reading off the gray card. You put the gray card in the same light as your subject, and then move in close with your meter and meter off that card and set your exposure accordingly. The one thing you want to make sure is that you are not casting a shadow on that card. You want to make sure it's in the same light as the subject. Another thing is, let's say you just have a camera with a built-in meter. You don't have a handheld meter, but you'd like to take an incident light reading. Well, you don't have to go out and buy an incident light meter. What you can do is taking a simple foam coffee cup, buy a whole pack of them for a couple dollars, and put it over your lens and aim the camera now with the foam cup over the lens at the source of the light. Now, I have a video on how to do that. I will leave a link in the description below for turning your camera into an incident light meter. And it works surprisingly well, and it's very inexpensive. Let me just pause here for a quick note. If you like videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. And the next video in this series, 35mm film photography for beginners, will be out the first Wednesday of next month. And that video will talk more about aperture and shutter speed and the creative uses of each. I hope this has helped you learn about exposure. It's one of the most important things to know when learning photography. You want to get good exposures. So I hope this has helped. Please, if you have any questions, send me an email, leave a comment in the comments below, and I will respond. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I usually come out with a new video every Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. So I will talk to you next time.